Welcome to today's webinar, The Parkmaker and the Formgiver, How Frederick Law Olmsted and Hobson Richardson Reinvented America's Public Spaces, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is The Parkmaker and the Formgiver, How Frederick Law Olmsted and Hobson Richardson Reinvented America's Public Spaces. You can also search for event number 925-8027. So today our speaker is Hugh Howard, a writer, historian, and student of the American past. Hugh Howard has written more than 20 books about architecture and landscape, presidents and painting, including Architecture's Odd Couple in 2015, The Painter's Chair in 2009, Houses of the Founding Fathers in 2007, and a memoir, House Dreams, in 2003. With each book he finds fresh joy in encountering uniquely American places, their creators, and telling their stories. An Addingham scholar, Hugh has lectured at many historic sites, symposia, libraries, museums, and universities, including Washington's Mount Vernon, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the University of Virginia, the National Portrait Gallery, Yale's Beinecke Library, Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, the Library of Congress, and the bicentenary of celebration of Olmsted's birth in New York Central Park with the National Association of Olmsted Parks. His latest book, Architects of an American Landscape, which he'll talk about today, was awarded the 2022 Victorian Society in America Book Award. Following his presentation, Hugh will answer as many questions as time permits. As always, you can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as always, we're going to get started today with a quick poll, just asking where everybody is from today. It's the usual poll. If you've been here before, you've answered it previously. If you need to have trouble responding, you may need to exit from full screen mode, and we'll give everybody a few seconds to do so, and then we'll turn it over to Hugh. And thanks to everybody for being here today. I know we have a number of landscape architects in the audience, as well as our usual planning crew. It's always interesting to see where people are from today. And we'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. And thanks for doing so. Okay, so according to our self-reported responses here, 36% of our audience today is in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 25% in the South, 18% in the West, 15% in the Midwest, and 7% today are outside the US. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hugh Howard. Welcome, Hugh.
Thank you, Michael. for the kind words and for the invitation to talk. Thanks as well to John Coleman for making the tech work. I think I'm about to put up my PowerPoint presentation, which will accompany my words. I'm delighted to talk to all of you today.
You're still not in full screen mode.
Okay. I guess.
You had it there for a second. Just if you go back to the PowerPoint.
About that.
Oh, no, that was the camera.
Okay. That's.
You go back to your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Oops, wrong one.
Okay. How about this?
No, we're gonna have to resend you the link.
How about this? Is that up?
No, I think you stopped sharing, so John's gonna have to resend you the prompt again.
Okay.
So you just have to go to you just have to go to sharing and click share screen.
Yes, to the sharing tab.
You already have it.
Oh, okay. I'm looking
Go
sharing.
over.
Oh, right there. Got it. All right.
Show screen and then select your PowerPoint. Okay, and then at the bottom. No, that's the bottom of the PowerPoint. Nope. To the
Next
right.
to the scale, next to the scale bar.
Right
Yep, there you go.
Click,
Yep.
click that. And it should come up anytime.
Yep, there you go. Good,
Okay.
go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Shall I start that again? Thank you all for coming. I do wish that we were all in the same room. In person is better. That way I can hear the chuckles if I say something funny, and also so I can see the guy in the second row who's just fallen asleep. But anyway, here we are across the country and even abroad rather than in one room. So thanks for joining us. The first slide here I put in part because it's about where this talk originates. That is in Maryland, the state of Maryland. Frederick Olmsted Sr. did a bit of work in Maryland, most memorably the 4 wee parks at Mount Vernon Place, one of which frames this picture. But he didn't do any other major jobs here, though he consulted a bit in the state. It was really in the next generation, after his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., also known as Rick, and stepson John took over the business, that the name Olmsted came to mean much more in Maryland. Many of you, I'm sure, have Olmsted parks in your cities that are proudly referred to as Olmsted. In fact, in writing this book, in talking to people in various places, in entertaining inquiries from friends and so forth, I tell them I'm working on Olmsted, and people would say, "Oh, we have a Olmsted Park," proud, bursting their buttons. And something like half the time, I'd have to say, well, actually, they're not all Frank Lloyd Olmsted Sr. parks, but they were done by the sons. That's a different thing, of course, but let it be said, he trained his boys very well. His son Rick practiced until about 1950. His son John died in 1920, but the brand survived into the 1970s, and they made good parks. Rick helped found the American Society of Landscape Architects in 1899. The landscape architecture program at Harvard was also launched by Rick Olmsted, and he was the first president of the American Planning Institute. That said, the sons are peripheral to my brief, and I must admit, I'm no expert in their work. That isn't the book that I wrote. One other disclaimer while I'm doing such things, I should admit up front that I'm a historian, not an architect or a planner. And my impression is that most of you are practitioners. So be forewarned that I'll be telling you stories more from a descriptive and narrative perspective than a prescriptive one. That said, underlying all this, the historical, the biographical aspects that preoccupy me, and the more practical topics like zoning, housing, and transportation that are your business, underlying all this is the genius of place, as Alexander Pope put it 300 years ago. And I think we all probably share a fascination, even an obligation, to pay due regard to that. Enough piano tuning. Michael told you that the title of my talk is The Parkmaker and the Formgiver, but I'm going to tell you a little bit of an origin story. Franklin writes The Parkmaker, obviously, and most likely the reason you tuned in, but this book exists because of his friendship and his collaborations with architect Henry Hobson Richardson. Now, I spent much of the last half dozen years with these two characters, and I hope I can convey in the next hour or so what extraordinary people they were. But when I was casting about for a new book, a subject for a new book, a half dozen years ago, I wanted to do Richardson. The rationale was that there are really three famous, internationally famous American architects. Thomas Jefferson is one. He's effectively responsible for the classical revival in this country, as well as being the founding father that he is. Frank Lloyd Wright is the second of the sort of triumvirate of American architects that if you talk to a European, his name is likely to come to mind. And the third is Henry Hobson Richardson. In his lifetime, in fact, the year before he died in 1885, the American Architect and Building News survey, a survey conducted by the American Architect Building and News, asked what were the best American buildings. The survey group was about 100 in number, and they were more or less half builders and half architects. And 85% of them came up with Trinity Church, which we're looking at here. Of the top 10, 5 of the most favored buildings in that survey were done by Henry Hobson Richardson. He was famous and admired and clearly the most significant designer of his time in the eyes of the professionals, as that suggests, but also in the eyes of Europeans. This building we're looking at here, Trinity Church in Boston, was the first American building that Europeans actually specifically came over to see. There hadn't been much of particular distinction in Europeans' eyes, at least, built on this continent until. Richardson also designed courthouses. He innovated the shingle-style house and did lots of other things that I'll be telling you about shortly. In any case, I wanted to write a book about Richardson because after his death, his fame gradually dissipated, and in fact, he's a largely unknown figure today. So I pitched my editor on this, and George, who's a very courtly and kindly man, said, well, yes, I know about Richardson. I like Richardson's work. I know it a little bit, having gone to college in Boston. But if nobody knows who he is, Hugh, who's going to buy your book? Well, a discussion ensued. It was an excellent question, obviously. And many months of research later, we decided that a dual biography would be the best way to go. I had by then learned that Richardson's most essential mentor had been, yes, Frederick Law Olmsted, and in turn, that Olmsted had found in Richardson much more than a friend. As Olmsted said to the woman he hired to write a biography of Richardson after his friend died, Richardson was the greatest comfort and the most potent stimulus that had ever come into my artistic life. Pretty high praise coming from Fred Olmsted. Early on, I came across this, by the way, and if I needed reinforcement as to what book I should be writing, how could I not want to write a book about an architect happy to dress up as a medieval monk? Now, as a student of architecture, I knew his work in a general way, but his life story had lots of good elements: victories, enthusiasm, a tragic and premature end. And of course, that friendship with Olmsted, together with a whole range of remarkable places and buildings and landscapes that they had designed. So I had a book to write. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction thing here. First of all, of Olmsted, since he's the older of the two men. He was born in 1822. He died in 1903. The fact he was born in 1922 has been a happy accident because this, of course, is his bicentenary year, and people are particularly interested in Olmsted about now. He was born a Connecticut Yankee in Hartford, His great something grandfather had been one of the original settlers in Hartford in the 1630s. His father was a successful dry goods merchant. And it's good that he was, because his finances helped underwrite Olmsted's career in his first 20-odd years of his adulthood. As a child, Olmsted traveled with his family. He clearly developed a taste for unspoiled countryside, which he would later call the scenic. But it would be many years before that became his life's work. He fully anticipated going to college and was just about ready to dive into intense studies for the Yale preparatory exams at the age of 15, when, although he should have known better as a country boy, he did a header into a stand of poison sumac. He got a completely awful case of blisters around his eyes. There was serious concern he might even lose his vision. And the doctor that he and his father consulted in New York said, well, this is really not the time for you to be doing a lot of booking, not the time for reading, not the time for studying. And with that, college went out the window. He never attended college aside for single semester auditing courses at Yale when his younger brother was at Yale. At 16, he was a surveyor's apprentice. He did that for 18 months, didn't much like it. He had a wanderer's temperament, as he put it later, and he enjoyed a decently restrained vagabond life. He became a clerk in a New York dry goods store, commuting back and forth between Brooklyn to the job in Manhattan. He became a China seaman, went to China and back on a clipper. It took a year. And it was so unsatisfactory experience. He was so sick that when he got off the boat at the wharf, his father didn't recognize him. He'd lost so much weight and he was so jaundiced. Then he became a farmer. He became a nurseryman. He had a farm on the Connecticut coast, another one on Staten Island, which he gradually turned into a nursery. And that was showing signs of success, but I guess it would be fair to say that he had what Joni Mitchell called the urge for going. The American South was one place that he went repeatedly and wrote about extensively. He wrote 3 books, including a long series that were compilations of a long series of columns he wrote for various newspapers, including at the start for a new newspaper called the New York Daily Times. But it was another book that he wrote after a trip he took to the UK or to England with his brother, called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer, that I think began to suggest his predilection for doing what he ended up doing. He visited Birkenhead. It's a park, it's a town across the Mersey from Liverpool, and they had just constructed a park there, designed by a man named Joseph Paxton, who was also responsible for the Crystal Palace and the spectacular landscape at Chatsworth. Birkenhead was 125 acres, started out as just flat land, but they excavated so it had some hills and filled in the low spots with water. Think of it in a sense as Central Park writ small, with meadows and waters and forests and rolling countrysides, bridle paths, and the rest. Olmsted called it a people's garden, and he was impressed. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, one that's essentially an excerpt from the book, and it concerns the moment when Olmsted discovered his vocation. After a good many years as something of a professional vagabond, at age 35, he became a parkmaker almost overnight. And it came together quite by accident. Until August 8, 1857, Olmsted had been little more than a witness to feats of park-making, a writer who liked parks he had seen in his European travels, but who had played no role in shaping landscapes beyond his own farm on Staten Island. Quite by accident, on a sunny Sunday afternoon in 1857, that all changed. Growing tired of the editing task before him, he was reading proof sheets for a series of articles then running in the New York Daily Tribune beneath the rubric, The Southerners at Home. He rose from his desk to head downstairs at the inn where he was staying near New Haven. He expected to find refreshment in the dining room, but to his delight, he saw a familiar face at one of the tables. The man was Charles Eliot. Eliot made his living as an iron merchant, but his passions lay elsewhere. The author of several books, including one called Cottages and Cottage Life, he had been a protege of Andrew Jackson Downing. Olmsted took a seat. Soon enough, the two diners zeroed in on a matter in which they both had an interest. A major park was about to be created on Manhattan Island. Poet and newspaperman William Cullen Bryant and Downing, the era's leading authority on both horticulture and domestic architecture, had begun promoting a park for New York more than a decade earlier. But a key inflection point had been reached when the New York State Legislature passed the Central Park Act in 1853. Since then, the city had acquired the necessary land, and just 4 months earlier, an 11-man board of commissioners had been formed to administer construction of the park. One of its charter members was the self-same Charles Eliot. Sitting next to me at the tea table, Olmsted later remembered, Eliot told me of the history of the commission. The two men's conversation and the course of Olmsted's life began to shift when Eliot explained that the commissioners planned to elect a superintendent at their next meeting. He would be the man charged with managing the construction of the park. Must he be a politician? Olmsted inquired. Eliot shook his head. No, the park is to be managed independently of politics. Olmsted agreed that a well and equitably run people's park could do inestimable good, and Eliot, pleased at his friend's enthusiasm, mused aloud that he wished Olmsted were a fellow commissioner. Then, in his next breath, Eliot gave voice to a different idea. Why not take the superintendency yourself? He asked Olmsted. Now, the possibility of such a job had never crossed Olmsted's mind, but he did not demur. Unexpected as it was, and yet so logical, even inevitable it seemed, the idea appealed to him. I'm not sure I wouldn't if it were offered me, he allowed. No, Eliot quickly explained. If Olmsted wanted the job, he would have to go to New York, file an application, and, Eliot warned him, he would have to fight through the hurly-burly of city politics. As Olmsted told the story 2 decades later, he decided in that instant to take the evening boat back to New York. He would think hard on this matter, he told himself, and confided in much in Eliot. I'll do it, he said, if no serious objection occurs to me before morning. None did. And I think we all know what happened. He pursued the job and was appointed superintendent a month later. With no final plan having been agreed to, a competition was held for a park design. Olmsted, working with Calvert Vaux, an English-trained architect who had come to the U.S. to work with Downing, who had died in the interim, put together what they called the Greensward Plan, which is pictured here. It was one of the 33 entries, but it would be the winner, and their template became the basis for the park we know today, one that remains remarkably true to its maker's vision. For Olmsted, it was a whirlwind. I was unexpectedly invited to take a modest public duty, he recalled, which led him to make landscape architecture my calling in life. He was, in short, handed his dream job, one he hadn't known he wanted. It was a public duty that would prove anything but modest. He would make America's first major city park and the essential prototype for all others. Many of those built in the course of the next 4 decades were of his imagining. Many more would be part of his legacy when John and Rick took over his practice in the mid-1890s. Now I'd like to introduce you to Henry Hobson Richardson. New Orleans born, he was well-to-do. His father was a merchant. On his mother's side, the family owned a substantial plantation on the River Road. There were enslaved people involved. He was handsome. He was musical. He was mathematical and spatial off the charts. He was the sort who can play multiple games of chess entirely in his head at one time. He decided he wanted to be an engineer. And at that point, if you wanted to be an engineer, you had to go to West Point. It was the only engineering school in the country. However, he had a speech impediment, a halt, a stutter. And so some wise person, or unwise as the case may be, at West Point decided that perhaps someone with a stutter wasn't officer material. So he was rejected, despite a recommendation from none other than Jefferson Davis. He ended up at Harvard after spending a year at the University of Louisiana, which subsequently became Tulane. He loved Harvard. He fit right in. He was stylish. He was a clothes horse all his life. He maintained and counted pools of London for his suits, Savile Row. He was a hail fellow, well met, immensely likable, and his social skills, as well as his Harvard years, would serve him well later on. Many of his clients were from Harvard or connected in some way too. I thought I'd turn that off, but sorry about that. Where was I? His senior year at Harvard, he decided he wanted to become an architect. And he wanted to study architecture, but there was no place in America where that could be done. So he enrolled in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. He'd been there less than a year when the Civil War broke out, and that left him with two bad options. He could come back and fight in the South, fight for the North. I apologize. He could come back and fight for the North and thereby find himself shooting at his brethren. Literally, a brother of his was in the service. Or he could fight for the South and shoot at all those good men from Harvard that he'd come to like in his 4 years at Harvard. So he did a third thing, found a better option, which was to return to Paris, stay there, and gain an education in architecture. Now, while he was there, of course, the North captured New Orleans, so his source of money, that well-to-do aspect that he had, disappeared. So he ended up having to apprentice for work in a couple of architectural firms during the day, as well as study in an atelier at night. In fact, it worked out pretty well because he had the nuts and bolts of the practical and he had all the theoretical that was on offer at the École. He drank deeply of European culture. His very good friend Henry Adams and he traveled a good deal in England, France, Paris. And when the war was over, he had a fiancée awaiting him in Boston. He had family in New Orleans, but nonetheless, he decided he wanted to launch his architectural career in New York. Pretty soon thereafter, his Harvard connections got him his first jobs, for the most part in New England, although not entirely. Did a renovation at the Century Club in New York. And finally, he accumulated enough revenue that he could marry his Boston sweetheart, which he did, Julia Richardson. They lived on Staten Island. He designed a house. They had children. He was a young architect of promise. At roughly the same time, Olmsted returned to New York. He'd spent the war years away from New York, 2 of them in Washington, founding the Sanitary Commission. The military had no effective medical corps. God knows how many lives he and Clara Barton saved as they created the Sanitary Commission and provided medical care, supplies, doctors, and the rest to the North, to the Union soldiers. He grew tired of that, however, cranky as he often was, with administrative types above him. And for the second 2 years of the war, he went to California, where he operated a mine in Mariposa, hoping that he would make a good deal of money. That he failed to do. The mines, as it happened, were played out. But he did something ever so much more important. Even then, when he went to California in 1863, he was a well-known park man. Central Park had become world famous, and the governor of California appointed him to write a report about the then little-known valley called Yosemite. Getting there in 1865 involved traveling more than 40 miles on horseback across rough terrain. The route was too rough for any sort of carriage, and fewer than 1,000 non-Native Americans had ever ventured there. On the way, he visited the giant sequoias at Mariposa, which you see here. And Olmsted, like most visitors since, was blown away with both Mariposa and Yosemite, and he believed they had to be preserved. The briefing document he prepared for Yosemite, in which he presented to an array of powerful public officials, would, in effect, lay the philosophical groundwork for the preservation of Yosemite and a generation later, the creation of the National Park Service. It's a great story, an important story, one that I tell at great length in the book. And by the way, a few years later, he would play a vital role in establishing the New York State Reservation at Niagara Falls. By 1865, however, Calvert Vaux had persuaded him to come back to New York City. They were about to build Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And by happenstance, Olmsted settled in the same neighborhood in Staten Island as Richardson. It was called Clifton. And he took the daily ferry from Vanderbilt's Landing, as did Richardson, to their respective offices in Lower Manhattan. Now, precisely when Fred and Hal met is lost in history. But I like to think of them glimpsing one another now and then on the ferry. And one day, by chance, perhaps they fall into conversation. Maybe Olmsted was drawn to Richardson, who had a genuine magnetism about him. Everybody said so. Maybe he made Olmsted smile or said something Olmsted hadn't thought of, which didn't happen much, in my opinion. Did Olmsted's intensity and intelligence appeal to Richardson, who was a man of boundless curiosity and enthusiasm? Whatever, whenever, they gradually fell into a rare marriage of minds, and by the late 1860s, they were working together. They co-designed a tomb for a cemetery in Washington, D.C. in 1868. They served on a commission in Staten Island to create a plan for development in 1869. It was one of the first such documents. Perhaps some of you know it. But the most important of their early jobs was the Buffalo State Asylum for the insane. The asylum would be Richardson's first design in the soon-to-be widely copied Richardsonian Romanesque style, and a great leap forward for American architecture. The United States previously had no style that was peculiarly its own. And Olmsted, whom Richardson invited to design the landscape, would be an essential collaborator. Now, at the time, state governments rarely paid for public buildings beyond governmental ones, but asylums for the care of mentally ill persons had become a new priority since there were a growing number of distracted persons wandering untended the streets of rapidly expanded metropolitan areas. Sound familiar? According to the best medical thinking of the day, many of these people could find a new equilibrium if given proper care away from the ills and distractions of the city. The assignment to create such a refuge was made to order for the new friends. The asylum's program called for a central administrative building flanked by living spaces on either side for hundreds of male and female patients. The wings would be in turn divided into a series of wards, as Olmsted expressed it, for so placing the violent and noisy patients that the quiet and convalescent could escape disturbance or annoyance from them. But the charge effectively ended there, leaving the solution to the designers. Richardson worked up a series of drawings before settling on his Romanesque central administration building. But it was Olmsted who figured out how to make the immense structure. It would be nearly half a mile in length and settle it into the landscape. The breakthrough came when Olmsted asked whether Richardson might consider breaking the long line of the facade. Rather than line up the administration building and the pavilions as if they were on a city street, why not set back each pavilion one to the next? Richardson adopted the idea immediately, and as you can see, he laid out a hospital in which one patient building was linked to the next by a curved corridor. This would increase light and circulation. Receding wings would also make the wide structure less monolithic from the front. At the rear, the open arms of the approaching wings would embrace the expanse of agricultural acreage that Olmsted planned for tillage and pasturage, with the expectation that the farmland would perform double duty as a source of food for the institution and a place for healthful labor for the patients. The resulting assemblage of 11 structures, 10 pavilions, 5 on either side of the main block, assumed a kind of flattened V formation that bore an unmistakable resemblance to a skein of geese in flight. Olmsted would surround it with a carriage path along the margins of the property for peaceable rides in what amounted to a self-contained countryside. Thick hedges and fences at the border would screen the hospital grounds from prying eyes, enhancing the sense of privacy, safety, and seclusion for patients. At the front, Olmsted specified breaks in the tree line to permit passers-by a perspective view of the handsome facade of the hospital building. Richardson incorporated elements of the Romanesque into his twin towered brownstone building, including characteristic round arches. But the widely admired building was very much the work of two heads working as one. The hospital complex, altogether a therapeutic place that served a common goal of enhancing the health, strength, and morality of those who worked there, who resided there. In time, the theory proved sound, by the way, as analyses of surviving records have found that the bucolic rather than bedlam approach to mental illness in Buffalo and elsewhere permitted roughly 2 out of 3 patients to return to their communities as functional members of society. Much of this giant building survives, as you can see, though sadly, most of Olmsted's landscape has been subsumed by the SUNY Buffalo campus. The one-time administrative building here at the center would fall into disuse before recent renovation is the aptly named Hotel Henry. The entire complex has been the subject of a remarkable public-private preservation program for roughly 20 years. At a recent lecture I gave in Massachusetts, a man involved told me something of the story, and apparently the hotel, which closed during COVID, will be reopening under new management. So not all the building has been conserved. It's an ongoing process. But whatever its future, Olmsted and Richardson created an extraordinary hospital for the insane in Buffalo. The immense building really looks like it belongs there because Olmsted helped plant it in its park-like setting. Now, I can't very well talk about Richardson and not talk a bit more about the building he is remembered best for, Trinity Church in Boston. For him, it was the building that made his reputation, and it remains his best known. I'm going to jump back into the book and tell you a Richardson story. The year is 1872. On the morning of March 8th, he got a letter from the Trinity Church Building Committee. The name Henry Hobson Richardson was well known by then. He had already designed 3 New England churches, and the letter began with a familiar refrain. You are requested to furnish designs for the erection of a church. This commission, however, he saw would be different. The last 3 houses of worship had been, in effect, parish churches, and this one would be more like a cathedral, his and Boston's Duomo. As one of 6 invitees, Richardson's firm would be competing with the best architects in the country, including the redoubtable Richard Morris Hunt of New York and Boston's Peabody and Stearns. But Richardson possessed the least experience of the group, and the deadline, jotted at the foot of the letter he held in his hand, was short. Plans to be sent in before May 1, 1872. He had 6 weeks. Though Richardson could hardly predict the outcome, he did understand that the freshly opened letter he held in his hand represented a major opportunity. But he was unintimidated, and seated in his office near Manhattan's southern tip, the unruffled Richardson, on an otherwise unmemorable morning, simply went about doing what he loved best. He turned the letter over, picked up his pencil, and let it speak on the sheet's blank verso. In short order, he rendered in graphic form his first rapid-fire thoughts in an esquisse, a very preliminary sketch of a very rudimentary floor plan. As you can see, the floor plan has the plus sign shape of a Greek cross, with 4 short arms of more or less equal length. Richardson noted the church's 90-foot breadth, the width specified in the letter, which was consistent with Trinity's recently acquired plot at the corner of St. James and Clarendon Streets in the Back Bay. The architect's simple yet full-blown conception had come to him in an instant, and as one young friend explained, Richardson had a rare intuitive sense that enabled him to strike at the foundation and grasp the whole truth at once. He soon made a trip to Boston from his offices in New York to meet with the building committee and Trinity's rector, Phillips Brooks. Brooks told Richardson he didn't want a long nave and that he didn't much like steeples. The architect returned to New York, completed the competition drawings, and submitted them on time. Then he waited. The decision came promptly. In June 1872, Richardson burst into the morning parlor of a neighbor's house. Brandishing a roll of drawings, he announced exuberantly, "I've got it." "I see you have," the lady of the house observed, bemused at the man's boisterous interruption of her family's quiet breakfast. "But what is it you have?" "I've got the church," Richardson exclaimed. "Trinity Church in Boston. I've got it." His thumbnail sketch, a crude crisscross of pencil strokes, had been an almost immediate epiphany that, as realized over the course of the next 5 years, became the great stone edifice that we know today in Copley Square, a great public space that is a worthy and controversial topic for another day. In the same way that Central Park established Olmsted, making him the central figure in American landscape design, Trinity Church elevated Richardson to the position of the most admired architect of his era. Now, I make a case in the book that Olmsted and Richardson had an enduring impact on the American landscape. That was true of the cityscape as well as the parks Olmsted designed. In Olmsted's case, he also designed the Capitol grounds in Washington, D.C., including those terraces on the west front and the steps that have been so much in the news since January 6, 2021, for all the wrong reasons. The steps are Olmsted, with an assist from Richardson. Now, Richardson brought his particular genius to downtown buildings too. There are several Chicago projects that make the case very well, perhaps best of all, his last great work, which survives, unfortunately, only in the pages of textbooks. But once it filled the city block bounded by Adams, Franklin, Quincy, and Wells Street. Pathetically, it's a 4-story parking garage today, but for half a century, it was the Marshall Field wholesale store. The footprint was large at 325 by 190 feet, amounting to nearly an acre and a half of floor space. The 7 tall stories would top out at a cornice 130 feet above the street. And since the store commanded an entire block, it would have 4 distinct public faces. It was a monster of a building, but not one that looked monstrous. One of Chicago's great men of architecture, Louis Sullivan, was stunned by it. When he first saw the building, then under construction, he promptly went back to the drawing board and revised his plans for what would become the auditorium building, replacing his own picturesque elements with the Richardsonian broad arches. Nor was this Sullivan's first encounter with Richardson. As a Boston kid, he had been mesmerized by Richardson's Brattle Square Church. As a first-year student at MIT and just 17, he had been converted. As he later wrote, the church became the fount of his architectural theology. The book had been conceived and brought to light, Sullivan observed, by the mighty Richardson. Nor was Sullivan the only Chicagoan to fall into Richardson's spell. Let us note here that the word organic was used to describe Richardson's architecture long before the sage of Taliesin co-opted it. That was, of course, in no small measure due to Richardson's collaborations with Olmsted. It's also notable that when Frank Lloyd Wright designed a home for his young family in Oak Park in 1889, he had just read the biography of Richardson, which was, by the by, the first biography of an American architect ever published. It appeared the previous year and had been initiated by Olmsted. It's no accident that Wright chose to build his home in the shingle style. His debt to Richardson would be apparent in his later work too, as he frequently used low arches, stone piers, roof lines, and shingle elements that were unmistakably Richardsonian. If you look at Richardson's train stations, and we'll look at one in a minute, excuse me, like so many other architects of his generation, Wright maintained what he himself admitted was a secret respect, leaning a little toward envy for H.H. Richardson. For the egotistical Mr. Wright, that was quite an admission. Let it be noted, however, about Wright's borrowings from Richardson, not a little was Olmstedian too. Olmsted and Richardson could hardly have been more different. Somber and serious, man of the mind, Olmsted usually seemed preoccupied with big thoughts. In contrast, Richardson loved nothing more than a groaning board, fine food, lots of drink, and most especially a willing audience for his fount of stories of goodwill. He was a man of laughter, unafraid of tears. Olmsted was small and always thin thanks to a nervous temperament and an endless series of maladies. A solid 6-footer, Richardson was matinee idle handsome in his 20s, though he ballooned to 350 pounds thanks to the kidney disease that killed him at just 47. After Richardson moved to Massachusetts in 1874 to supervise construction of Trinity, Olmsted began spending his summers there. Late in the decade, he got his first major landscape commission in Boston for the Back Bay Fens, the first of many that resulted in what we now know as the Emerald Necklace, the series of parks and parkways. In 1881, Olmsted was thinking seriously about moving home and office to Massachusetts. As Olmsted's son Rick told the story, on a winter Sunday morning, first light revealed a thick blanket of fresh snow. Olmsted was staying at the Richardsons at their Brookline home at 25 Cottage Street, as he often did. He looked out the window at the crystalline brightness and spied a horse-drawn snowplow and several laborers clearing the street. A town official supervised on horseback. The tableau before Olmsted set his resolve. "This is a civilized community," he said, turning to his host and friend Richardson. "I'm going to live here." The home and property Olmsted developed, he named it Fairstead, is today a National Park Service site. It's a short walk to Richardson's Cottage Street home. The Olmsteds moved to Boston, cemented the men's friendship and that of their wives and children. Again, according to Rick Olmsted, who was by then a teenager, "I was in and out of their house and office all the time with father and the Richardson children." Now, there's much more to say, though my watch tells me there's not so much time, but I do want to touch on a couple of general areas, one of which is the library projects. We take the institution of the public library for granted today, but it wasn't until the third quarter of the 19th century that there even were libraries for everybody, like city parks, by the way. And Richardson, with Olmsted's help in some cases, created some early examples, models that were widely copied. One, as pictured here in a perspective drawing from Richardson's office, was settled into the downtown landscape. For my money, it's a bit park-like, a restful oasis for mind and body. This is one example, but there were others, a gem in Quincy, the Billings at the University of Vermont, and one of Richardson's most majestic buildings, also in Massachusetts, in Woburn. This is the book room. That's the building as a whole. Now, I can't talk about these times without reference to the railroad, the literal engine of economic growth and the matrix that bound the immensity of the United States together. There are telling examples of this in Richardson and Olmsted's work, namely their suburban rail stations. The context, of course, is that the US population grew enormously, in fact, 8-fold in Olmsted's life. He was born into a country where literally no one lives more than a mile or two from nature. Cities had only begun to spread in the 1820s, but the city exploded. Suburbs didn't exist, and then they did. And together, Olmsted and Richardson devised welcoming portals to suburbs like this one. Richardson's building sits long and low, unobtrusive and welcoming. Once more, Olmsted made his station look as if it belonged there. As their friend and pioneer horticulturist Charles Sprague Sargent explained, the whole effect was to make the station seem part and parcel of nature's handiwork. Richardson designed fewer than a dozen rail stations, but his successor firm, Shepland, Rutan, and Coolidge, designed dozens more, and hundreds of imitations popped up across the country. Now, I can't not talk about another Richardson project that would influence the thinking of architects for generations, and one worthy of another lecture all by itself, the so-called Ames Gate Lodge. This building is not Greek, it's not Georgian, it's neither Gothic nor Richardsonian Romanesque, exactly. It did not fit neatly into a neat category. It was not truly vernacular, since no one can point to another building near or far that resembled it, though many would in the future, among them some of Wright's ground-hugging houses. The Gate Lodge might best be described as geological, but whatever you call it, the Gate Lodge was liberating for Richardson, trained as he had been in the rituals of the École des Beaux-Arts, and for Olmsted, who, as a friend and advisor, saw the man-made fused with nature. As he increasingly liked to do, Richardson drew upon natural colors and textures, and under Olmsted's influence, the line of demarcation between building and site blurs. The building appears to have emerged from the earth on which it stood. As, by the way, does another Olmsted-Richardson collaboration, Stonehurst in Waltham, Massachusetts, and for that matter, the Town Hall in northeastern Massachusetts. A quick comment on this rendering. The sort of pale ink that you see of the building itself, the rendering of the building, that was done by some draftsman or other in Richardson's office under his guidance. But the much darker ink renderings, that's the hand of Olmsted. You can see how, in a sense, this is a page that the two minds are kind of binding on a single drawing. Now, of course, Olmsted's last great works, one of his last great works was Biltmore, built on a mountaintop in North Carolina, owned by George Washington Vanderbilt. He was a tree man who would become a park man, and there he pioneered sustainable forestry in another of his significant careers, if you will. And then there was Riverside, the nation's first planned suburban community. It's a place of such evident livability. The houses were well set back from the streets, walks and wheelways were separated, generous common grounds were plentiful, that it became received knowledge for untold thousands of suburban developments over the next century and a half. As Olmsted was showing us how to integrate nature into our lives, Richardson was inventing American idioms, among them the shingle style, of which this is perhaps the simplest example. Now, Richardson's name, as I mentioned earlier, has long since lost the currency that it had in the late 19th century. He died so young that he left a mere 80 buildings. Just for comparison, Frank Lloyd Wright, who lived to age 91, would build more than 500. Olmsted was a lifelong student of farming, of slavery, of parks and parklands, of botany and forestry and the building arts, and of what we would call environmentalism, though that was a term he would not have recognized. I would argue that all these pieces coalesced in his mind in his views of the scenic, as he liked to put it, and for its roles in society, social class, and broadly speaking, the city. He was a true visionary. Now, some of that came from the not so complicated understanding that landscape takes decades to mature. If you plant a tree too close to a house, in 10 or 15 years, it'll be a problem. He understood that a landscape designer has to think not just a decade or two or three ahead, but generations into the future. As Charles Eliot Norton put it in a condolence note to Rick, few men have done better service than he, service beneficent not only to his own generation, but to generation after generation in the long future. I think even today we can say amen to that. So many of his ideas have had a real buoyancy. I couldn't help but think of him when I read a piece in the New York Times recently with the self-explanatory title, "Since When Have Trees Existed Only for Rich Americans?" If that isn't essential Olmsted, nature, civics, class, urban life all rolled into one, I don't know what is. Olmsted was a parkmaker with a deep sense of democracy. Richardson was a formgiver. His rail stations, libraries, commercial buildings, and open plan houses redefined how Americans thought about buildings. Yet perhaps the most satisfying part of writing this book was coming to understand the deep bond, akin to a brotherhood, that Richardson and Olmsted had. When I was writing this book, I used the working title Boulder Brothers. They were brothers in a sense who loved most to work in stone. Together, they evolved a fresh vision, one that more often than not employed rude stonework to meld their constructions to existing terrain. Together, they addressed the demands of an increasingly urban culture while catering to both democratic values and the American compulsion for pragmatic answers. As the nation came into its own, these two men of genius employed the gifts of nature and their innate passion for beauty to redefine the country's rapidly changing landscape. Thank you for listening. And I think maybe we're going to have some time for Q&A.
Yes, Hugh, we will. And thanks for that. We'll ask you to turn your camera on so everybody can see you as we go through the Q&A. And thanks to everybody who submitted questions through the questions tab. We're going to go through here till about 2:30. So if you have any other questions, you can go ahead and submit them, and we'll just to get through as many as we can in the next 32 minutes or so. And I'll just kind of jump right in here, Hugh. So the first question here is from Dennis McCarthy, who says, as a longtime resident of Waltham, Massachusetts, I was happy to see the extensive coverage of the Robert Treat Paine estate in your book. But this collaboration is not well known. Why do you think that is? When I first entered the home, the first thing that popped into my mind was how it reminded me of Frank Lloyd Wright's subsequent designs.
Interesting question. Historic houses don't have the same kind of energy about them that they did in the years after the bicentennial. That was a great time for historic house museums. I suppose that's one factor. It isn't, it's run by the city of Waltham in a kind of quiet way. I wish it got more publicity. I wish there were more energy and money to be spent in promoting it. I guess I don't know the answer, although what I can do is reinforce Dennis's notion that it's a place that really rewards a visit, because it's Wrightian, it's Richardsonian, it's Olmstedian. It's a very special place.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Next question here is from Erica Johnson, who asks, I've long been interested in the machine politics of the mid-19th century, especially in New York City. Can you elaborate on how this intersected with Olmsted and Richardson's prominence in their respective design professions? And would Olmsted have become a recognized name without the Central Park Commission?
First of all, I'm going to discard a piece of that question, because Richardson's work in New York was really not so significant. So I'm not sure that his interaction with the powers that be in New York are particularly revealing. On the other hand, I think that there's much to be said about Olmsted and his interactions with New York, the people at Central Park in particular, but beyond that also. Yes, I think it's as the story I told, I think, illustrates, the fact that he became a parkman was almost serendipity. It was a great good fortune that day he had that conversation with Eliot, and that Eliot gave him the good guidance to do everything he could to get the job, which he did, by the way. He solicited recommendations and references from all kinds of powerful people, not a few of whom were members of the Century Club, which then, as now, is peopled with people of influence in the city. But to me, I think the most interesting part of Olmsted's interactions with the city of New York, and particularly the Park Commission, is that he had endless arm wrestling matches with them. You know, some of them were very early on when he had a penny pincher named who made his life very difficult as he was trying to build a park. At one point, some wise guys decided that they didn't like the entrance to the park and they were going to hire Dick Hunt to design this very grandiose kind of classical entrance, which Olmsted did everything he could to fight off and succeeded. Later, very shortly before he moved to Boston, in fact, this was one of the reasons he moved to Boston, was again, folks were interfering with his park because he really regarded it as his and Box's park. They wanted to put a race course way up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a horse race course, which he thought was a completely absurd idea. And again, he managed to fend that off. So I guess if there's a moral to be drawn here, it's that that Olmsted had the courage of his convictions, and he was a tenacious fighter. And not a little of the time he had to fight the bureaucracy. Sound familiar, anybody?
I'm sure that will resonate. Next question here is from Anatoly Upart, who asks, could you speak, if possible, to what extent the phenomenon conceived and developed by Richardson and Olmsted has a European counterpart, if any, and how are they, if placed within a larger Western world context?
You know, I guess I can only go so far as to say that Richardson's work was that there are a fair number of Richardsonian buildings in a number of European countries, particularly in Scandinavia. So he was very much a known and admired quantity. I guess as far as Olmsted is concerned, his greatest single, maybe not innovation, but one of the most wonderful things about Central Park is it is truly a people's park. It's designed for everybody. In fact, he very much had in mind that rich people in the United States, if they wanted to, could go to the Adirondacks. They could go to Europe. They could go to wherever they wanted to get away, to the beach, to the shore, and spend a week or a month or more elsewhere. But working people who were working 6 days a week or 6.5 days a week, they really couldn't afford, they didn't have time, they didn't have money to go someplace else, but they did need to be exposed to the natural world. And that was the genius of Central Park, was that it was aimed at exposing people to, again, his term, the scenic. And I think that in Europe, there was a great tradition of royal parks. There wasn't a particular tradition of city parks, of public parks, Birkenhead being something of an exception. And I think that Olmsted's fame and notoriety and miscellaneous connections, he traveled extensively, knew many, many, many folks in Europe. I think that probably enhanced that movement in Europe, but I'm no expert.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Jessica Brown, who says that she's listening from Louisville, where we have a beautiful system of Olmsted parks and parkways that have shaped the growth and the culture of our city in innumerable ways. They are obviously a treasure. However, similar to the infrastructure and tree canopy woes of many other cities, they are in some places suffering from significant deterioration. What can we do as a community beyond the obvious funding to preserve and protect those assets?
Yeah. Well, you know, funding is the obvious thing. I guess a parallel case would be when I got out of college and moved to New York City nearly 50 years ago. Central Park was a wreck, or that's a slight exaggeration, but Central Park was not. Olmsted was turning over in his grave, shall we say. The plantings were in bad shape, had been misused, and there was really no one piloting the ship. And about that time, there was an organization called the Central Park Conservancy that was established, that is a marvelously well-funded organization. They do fantastic things to take care of the park, not least because there are a lot of very well-to-do people who live in the perimeter of the park, for which the park is effectively their front yard. So I think money and influence is obviously critical. And I think some level of independence is also very desirable, if at all possible. Cities' politics change from one administration to the next. Priorities change. If you have some independent entity, even if they don't actually have ownership, but are in a position to lend, not only provide monies, but lend expertise and guidance, I guess that big picture, that would be my single suggestion.
Great, thanks, Hugh. A question here from Kathleen Maher, who asks, is there a list of surviving Richardson buildings in America?
Let's see. No, not that I know of. There's a terrific book called Henry Hobson Richardson, His Complete Works, something like that. The author's last name is Ochsner, O-C-H-S-N-E-R. Was published several decades ago, but it's still in print. You'll find it in most good architectural collections. And it's as very thorough coverage, and it notes what stands and what doesn't. But I don't know the list specifically, but you would find what you're looking for in Ochsner, I think.
Great, thanks, Hugh. Here's a question from Kelly Brown, who asks, how did Olmsted participate in the Central Park design competition when he was superintendent for the park construction? And isn't this an obvious conflict of interest?
Well, we think of conflicts of interest a little bit differently in 2022 than people did in 1857, I think, first of all. Secondly, he did ask his boss, the guy who was actually, I forget what his title was, but a man named Colonel Ville, who was actually in charge, and he said, do you mind if I enter the competition? And Ville, who's at that point, his first plan was the existing plan, which satisfied no one, by the way, with the possible exception to Ville. And Ville said, no, if you want to, go for it. So I guess he got permission of his betters, and he went ahead and did it. And of course, the way he did it was he used the expertise that he was accumulating by being there every day. So he knew more about the topography, the layout, what was there, what was not there, what needed to be created. And he and Calvert Vaux spent countless hours over a period of the design time, which was, I think the design was delivered at the end of March, and I think they entered the competition maybe in December, something like that. So 3 or 4 months worth of time. They spent every waking hour that they weren't working, paying attention to the plan and devising solutions.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Next question here is from Domini Cunningham, who asks, in Easton, Massachusetts, there's a rockery that was done by Olmsted. I don't remember Olmsted Senior or Junior. I don't remember which, but it was a project he wasn't pleased with once it was complete, to the point where he wrote a letter to his client that his name not be associated with the project. In your research, did you find evidence of any lesser known projects that were used to influence their later work?
Lesser known projects that were used to. I do know the rockery. It's actually a Civil War monument. It exists. I guess I think the answer to that is no, I don't. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, I'm curious whether Olmsted and Richardson had an opinion of the types of land uses and structures that should be adjacent to the public spaces they focus their attention and effort creating.
Interesting. One of the pitches that Olmsted made when he was invited to design a park or to propose a park, I'm thinking of his visit to Buffalo in particular, was that if you build this park, it will enhance real estate values all around it. So to the extent that he was very conscious of what development would occur around it, I think that, yes, he was concerned with that. But I don't remember coming across in any of his reports, and every park he designed that I know of, he not only did some renderings, but often even before he did any renderings, he did very detailed descriptions, long, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 word reports describing what the park would be like, because of course he was a very good writer. You know, he came to it in a sense. He came to park making in a sense as a journalist. I mean, that had been the world in which she had been most successful prior to becoming a park man. So he certainly was conscious of what was around, but I don't recall coming across anything in which he tried to exercise any control to dictate what was nearby. But I think he was aware that he was enhancing the livability and the value of those pieces of property, those adjacent pieces.
Great, thank you. Next one here is from Alan Oberst, who says, greetings from Buffalo, just down the road from the Richardson Olmsted complex. When I was in Boston this spring for the Olmsted conference, I had the chance to explore Copley Square and Trinity Church. There have been several iterations of designs for Copley Square, none of them proving quite satisfactory. So now planners are at work creating a new one. Wouldn't planners be well advised to take an approach that is well informed by Richardson and Olmsted?
For sure, for sure. Copley Square, even in its imperfect state, and I've known it in several incarnations, and over the course of being a Massachusetts boy, over the course of many decades, it's still a pretty wonderful place. The church is there. Facing the church is Charles Fallon McKim's Boston Public Library, which is a wonderful building. Museum of Fine Arts used to be there, but it's gone. But it's a lovely open space and a very welcoming space, despite the fact that maybe no one has yet taken full advantage of that spot. Yes, I mean the principles of Olmsted and Richardson, Olmsted in particular, and this would be useful, and I would hope that people would be thinking that way. And I wish they would get away from the predominance of concrete and they could go to some kind of, a richer in vegetation approach. But it isn't a very big space, and I see that it's an immense challenge. And I'm no landscape designer, but I guess we'll wait and see what comes next, because it is a source of ongoing controversy. I know, just in the last few years.
Thanks, Hugh. Next question here is from Robert Sarnia, who says, can you remind us how the renderings of the Trinity Church tower variations by McKim and Stanford White came to be?
Yes, it was a lengthy process, and the biggest single factor in the transition from the first drawing to the second, third, fourth, fifth, however many incarnations there were, was the weight of the structure. The Back Bay is that neighborhood in Boston, lovely neighborhood in Boston. It's called the Back Bay because it was a bay. It was drained. They brought in something like 30 feet of fill from miscellaneous towns, suburban towns just west of Boston. And in order to build the church, in order to build Trinity Church, they had to drive, I think it's something approaching 5,000 tree trunks, cheek by jowl with one another, into the ground. And then on top of that, they built slabs of stone, and then they built a church on top of that. So in effect, the church was built on what was effectively a wetland. Extraordinary as it sounds, it hasn't gone anywhere, so they clearly did it well. But there was concern when they had a much higher tower, when Richardson's original design for a much taller tower, that it would sink into the mud. So they reduced its weight rather significantly in 2 or 3 different stages. So I think that was the biggest single factor. It probably didn't hurt that McKim did one of the designs and he went off to start his own firm, and then Stanford White had been elevated to the chief draftsman position, and he was a part of that. But it was also a committee process in which many people had their voices heard, not least Phyllis Brooks, the rector of the church. So it's an interesting story.
Thanks, Hugh. Robert also had a comment here that I'll share with you to respond to, which is, I'm so intrigued to hear Richardson described as largely unknown by the public. While that underscores how architecture-centric and New England-centric I must be, next thing we know, someone will tell me that Frank Furness is also not a household name.
I've got very bad news for you. That too is true. Once you get outside of professional architectural spheres, I'm afraid neither Richardson nor Furness, talented though they were, they're just not household names. I can't tell you how many times I would say to people would say to me, "What book are you working on?" And I would say, "I'm doing a dual biography of Olmsted and Richardson." And people would say, "Oh yeah, Olmsted, he's a Central Park guy, right?" But who's Richardson?
Well, that's why we do webinars like these as well. So
Indeed.
thanks for being with us today. We have got a couple questions in this realm, and here's one, I guess, from Edward Holmes that I'll ask you, which is, can you speak about the displacement of neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods of color, for the construction of Central Park?
Yeah, I touch on that a little bit in the book. There was a significant neighborhood in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Seneca Village, that was a pretty well-established African-American neighborhood. I think there was a tavern, I think there was a church, there was a barber shop, there were a number of different retail stores. I don't know what the population was. I don't know that anybody does, but I'm guessing 100 or 200 people, something like that. And they were displaced. Now, everybody was compensated. Were they compensated adequately? Probably not. Should they have been, kicked out of there? Well, in retrospect, possibly not. Although, I don't know. This is one of those greater good conversations. That park has brought, lots of pleasure to people, black and white, and everything else for a period of 150 years. And we're playing paradigmatic stories here too. The historic paradigm then was so different than it is now. I'm not sure we do it today. I'm not sure it was a good thing. But I will add that it was done by the time Olmsted came along. So if we're going to blame somebody, if we're going to be cranky with people about this, and people have a right to be, clearly, it can't be with Olmsted, because by the time he came aboard in 1857, the 5,000 odd parcels that had to be purchased in order to construct Central Park had been purchased. The deal was done, the business was done. So he was given essentially tabula rasa without having to get involved with kicking people off of their rightful owned properties.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Jeff and a bit Zeno. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, which I'm sure I did. That is, Hugh, are you familiar with the quote, I believe, that was attributed to Frederick Law Olmsted, that goes something like this: "You can build the best system of parks, but unless they're connected to places where people live, they are not living up to their potential"?
I don't know that quote. Those sound like wise words to me. But I have not read every word that Frederick Law Olmsted ever wrote. I haven't even read all of there's a collection of it's selected papers, which is, I think, 12 or 13 volumes of roughly 500 pages each. And those, again, are selected papers. I haven't read all of those, not to mention the, 100%, 200%, 300% more that are in the Library of Congress, because he was a prolific writer. He may have said it, couldn't prove it by me.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Next one here is from Arlene Gilman, who asks, are Olmsted and Richardson remembered in any way on Staten Island?
Yes, the Richardson's house survives. It's a private home. It's a not remarkably interesting Second Empire house, but it survives. And Olmsted was involved a little bit with Vanderbilt and had something to do with there's a mausoleum, there's a landscape surrounding the family graveyard that he had something to do with. And I think there are 2 Olmsted houses, one of which may be a private home and one of which I think is in the process of maybe being preserved, it may be owned by the city of Google and learn the accurate information, but the short answer is yes, there is some fabric that survives. There's some real connective tissue between the 2 guys in Staten Island, which was a very important place for them for years. Their report, by the way, which I made reference to just in passing in my talk, which was commissioned in 1869, was what we should do with our town, how we should develop it, and so forth. And it's a very useful report, which the town fathers completely ignored.
Thank you. Next question is here. Do you think we could have an Olmsted and a Richardson in 2022? And if so, who would that be and what would that look like?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm not sure that given the developed state of things that we're talking about an opportunity that was anywhere near as wide open as the American city was in the 1850s and 60s when Olmsted began his practice and carried on for the rest of the century until he was essentially retired by his sons in 1895 because he was losing track of things. I guess it's very hard to imagine that the opportunity is as wide and broad for either that or for the likes of Richardson, who, new building types were required with the advent of the railroad, with the growth of the city, with the the increasing density of town, and had to have bigger buildings and so forth. I just don't see that the auspices are there. And I really don't know enough about today's contemporary designers to say which one or another of them would be the genius that you're looking for.
Great, thank you. Next one here is from one of our colleagues here at MVP, Dan Rosen, who says that he read your book and loved it and wonders, are there any regular or organized tours of the Olmsted Richardson sites in the Boston area?
The Richardson, I'm sorry, the Olmsted Fairstead, the Olmsted, if you will, in Brookline is a National Park Service site. It's operated by park rangers, and that site can be toured, absolutely. Whether there are people who walk around town, and by the way, you can take a very good tour of Trinity Church. I know that's possible. I suspect that there's somebody or other, I would go online and ask the question, local tours, because there is, as the previous questioner suggested, there is a sense in Boston that Richardson belongs to Boston, that there's a sense of pride about Richardson. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't someone who gives tours. I know that at AIA conventions and things like that in years past, there have been tours given because I've seen outlines for those. So it definitely happens, but whether it's a regular ritualized thing, I couldn't tell you.
Great, thanks, Hugh. Next one here, again from Arlene Gilman, who's asking, can you talk a bit more about how Richardson and Olmsted work together, and how often is there a true collaboration between a landscape architect and architect throughout the life of a project?
Well, the answer to the latter is not often enough. And I think pretty much everybody listening would probably agree to that. I mean, people are very happy to spend $1 million on a house and spend $10,000 on landscaping it. And that's silly. I think, and it's made all the more silly when you look at the moments when Olmsted and Richardson did work together. Again, Stonehurst is a great example of this. Richardson and Olmsted, in fact, Olmsted went first to look at the property that Robert Treat Payne had to see where the house should be put, even before Richardson went to look at the property. And I don't think there was any disagreement between the two men. I think that they thought alike, and Richardson clearly profoundly respected what Olmsted had to say. And I think that is the ideal paradigm. You start at the beginning, you both, throw your ideas on the table and you hash it out as to what will work. I think as far as their examples of that collaboration, I think there's many in Northeastern. They did a total of something like 20 jobs between them for the Ames family. The Ames family essentially was a captive company town where they made shuttles. And they work together very well there. So that's a great place if you want to look at the way they work together. But the Insane Asylum in Buffalo is another one, and obviously the Payne House in Waltham. But there are others. Not a ton. They didn't do 100 projects together. They were never partners, either officially or legally or anything. I think their collaboration was informal, and yet there were opportunities when it was the most natural thing in the world, and they produced some extraordinary work.
Great, thank you. We have time for a few more, and we might go over a minute or two if that's okay, Hugh. We've gotten a number of questions here. And thanks to everybody for participating. We had almost 900 people on earlier. Michael Malloy asks, if you know, how well did Eric Larson capture Olmsted in The Devil in the White City?
I think well, although he didn't really pretend to capture the man's life. The Devil in the White City really focused on that moment, that Chicago moment, the first half of the last decade of the 19th century. It's a delight. It's a very satisfying, very enjoyable book, by the way. But Olmsted's life, of course, was much longer, much more complicated. And at that point, he was almost debilitated by it. He had tinnitus, so his ears were ringing constantly. He had a lot of trouble sleeping. His memory was beginning to fade. Again, he would be pushed out of the business by, not pushed out, but he would more or less voluntarily leave the business just 2 years later because he couldn't keep track of people's names and was, undoing things that he had agreed to do earlier on. But I think it's a very strong book, and I think that as a snapshot of Olmsted in that particular point in his life, it's sound.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Linda Rideout, who asks, what is your opinion on the significance of the emerald necklace on the Boston landscape? And has there been any reproduction of the aesthetics throughout the country?
Well, what's not to like? It's a fantastic park system. It didn't exist, and Olmsted came along, and it did exist. He didn't do the Boston Garden or the Common, which were already there when he was hired, but he designed the Fens. That was the first park he did. And it's worth saying about the Fens, by the way, that it's a very interesting example of park making because it's as much about hydrology as it is about tourism or making a place for people to have fun and frolic, because it was a stinky wasteland where literally sewage from a couple of suburban towns were pouring downhill and a couple of rivers, and the Charles River would rise over its banks. So there was this area where there was almost no flora and fauna because of all the sewage and all the salt water. And he devised a methodology using dams and using wetlands and so forth that turned it into a habitable park, a quite wonderful park. The original Fenway Park, long before there was a baseball team, there was a park called Fenway Park. So I think that the emerald necklace is, a spectacular example of how, even when a city is developed, you can insert bits and pieces, which he did over a period of a couple of decades. And we heard about Louisville earlier. Louisville has something like that. The Chicago parks, there's also a similar linkage between different bits and pieces that Olmsted and subsequently others worked on. And Buffalo, good models, good examples.
Thank you. Next one here is from Frank Turner, who notes that more than 20,000 people worked on Central Park and only 6 lives were lost in the process, which is remarkable for the times. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, it is remarkable. And it's not least remarkable because they used a whole lot of dynamite. There's some statistics about this, but they used more dynamite than I forget, staggering amount of dynamite. But Olmsted, among his other skills, and they were many, he was a superb manager. That's one of the reasons he was able to create the Sanitary Commission. It's one of the reasons he was hired at Mariposa. It's one of the reasons he was so successful as a parkmaker, because he was very good at managing people. And I think management skills involves all kinds of things, including procedures and safety concerns. And clearly that was manifest in Central Park. It probably should also be said, however, that a lot of the work that was done at Central Park was done by guys with shovels and wheelbarrows. So the dangers of that are not quite the same as when you're using these immense pieces of equipment, which is not a knock on Olmsted at all. It's just a recognition of how the technology changed.
Thank you. Next one is from Alan Oberst, who has a follow-up regarding the collaboration they had on the New York State Capitol building in Albany. And he asks, what seems especially extraordinary is that Olmsted was so heavily involved in what was primarily an architectural project. Is it clear the degree to which Olmsted meaningfully contributed to those architectural discussions, and did Olmsted absorb some architectural skills from Richardson and vice versa? And did Richardson absorb any of Olmsted's genius of place?
Yeah. I think it was absolutely a share and share alike. I think that there's no question in Richardson's case that he learned how to set a building into the landscape as much from Olmsted as he did from anything else. And his instincts were not what Olmsted's were, but he took those on board. The steps that I showed of the Capitol in Washington, I think Richardson had no drafting involvement with that. I think he brainstormed a little bit, but I think the drawings came from Olmsted's office. So I think that in turn, Olmsted, took on some of his friend Richardson's skills, so they could, they could both do a lot of different things. I don't know if that's there was another question buried in there that I think I may have lost.
I guess the influence of each on the other's work in terms of the sense of place for Richardson.
Yeah, I mean, yes, no question. I don't think you can look at an Olmsted work, look at a Richardson work, at least in the later years, and not see a little piece of Olmsted here and there. They were strongly influenced one another, as Olmsted was the first to acknowledge.
Great, thank you. I guess we also got a couple questions in this realm. Can you describe how Olmsted used or chose not to use native plantings in his designs?
I'm not at all sure that that's 100% true. I think it was a very broad canvas for him. I think he used what he thought would work, and he didn't feel in any sense restricted by what was already there. On the other hand, I think sometimes he did. I don't know the plan for Stanford in detail, but when he went out, one of the three great projects at the end of his career was Leland Stanford Junior University. We call it Stanford today, along with Biltmore and the Columbia Exposition. And when he went out there, his knowledge effectively was New England, Northeast, East Coast, temperate zone kind of plantings. And all of a sudden he was in this arid place that had very different soils and very different growing season. And he made a very big point out of coming to understand what the native plantings were and using them. Now, did he use ones that are only native to a 30-mile radius? I couldn't tell you. But he definitely was highly aware that that what he was planting in California had to be California was going to survive, because he just wasn't going to create a new Harvard. That's not what Leland Stanford wanted, and that's not what Olmsted gave him.
Great, thanks, Hugh. So throughout this, you mentioned also that the Ivy Bookshop here in Baltimore will take orders online. They also have a number of copies available in the bookstore for those who are local to Baltimore. And I know it's also available at other places online. But we have a question from John Martins, who asks, says it's very interesting history. Is your book available in audio format as well?
Unfortunately, it's not as yet. There's an ongoing discussion there, which I hope will produce some fruit, but it is not. That said, it is going to come out in paperback in January. And while it's available at the Ivy for those who are in the neighborhood, of course, it's generally available, with online retailers and lots of good local bookstores. Always in favor of independent bookstores when possible.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks to the Ivy for working with us to make that link available for the audience if you choose to use it. And as usual, we've run out of time, and we also have more questions than time permits. So we will share everything with you that was received, and you can see those in the audience can see his contact information, including his website. So I guess to wrap up today, do you have any closing thoughts for us, Hugh?
I guess very briefly, writing this book was a great privilege to wander into the minds and works of two remarkable practitioners. It's fun to write a book where you have two stories, because if you ever get even slightly tired of one, you can always shift to the other. So that was a pleasure. But I think the great surprise to me going in, as I did, thinking that I wanted to write about Richardson, which was a joy, and I found him an extraordinarily likable and appealing figure, and also a sad figure in the sense that he didn't live up to his potential, I don't think, dying at 47, and I would love to know what he would have done. And I would argue that probably if he'd lived as long as Frank Lloyd Wright, he would be as well known as Frank Lloyd Wright, but that's a what if, who knows. Having said all that, though, I think maybe the greatest joy of this was to meet Olmsted and get to know him much better. I knew his work from Central Park, having been a long time New Yorker, and I knew some of his other parks. But, you know, as I worked on this book, it became increasingly clear to me that he was, you know, someone who could really see the future. He was one of the great visionary, his was one of the great visionary minds of the 19th century. And I hope that comes across in the book. I think it really does come across when you look at the breadth of his work as a park maker and as a man who saved natural places like Yosemite and Niagara, and who has to be regarded as really one of the founding fathers of the environmental movement, which is in itself important. And I wish he were alive today so that he could advise us as we think about climate change. That park I mentioned a few minutes ago, Fenway Park, or the Fens, as it's better known today. When Hurricane Ida hit Boston a few years ago, a whole bunch of Boston skyscrapers got flooded up, half a story up. The Fens handled the rising waters without problem. So he was a man who really could see the future, plan for it, and we could use somebody like him today. Anyway, but thanks to you, Michael, for doing this, and to all of you who came, and it's been an enjoyable hour and a half for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hugh, and thanks for being with us today. With that, we're going to conclude our webinar, The Parkmaker and the Formgiver, How Frederick Law Olmsted and Hobson Richardson Reinvented America's Public Spaces. I would like to offer a giant thank you to Hugh Howard for an excellent and informative presentation, to Justina Batchelor of Grove Atlantic, who helped make this happen, and to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helped to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including our second walk-in-hour with the Maryland Department of Transportation this Thursday, which is Equity and Walkability, Improving Pedestrian Infrastructure in Underserved Neighborhoods. Also, the essential value of street trees in city making and sustainable urban design with Dan Burden and Victor Dover, which will be on Monday, October 17th, and other walk-in-hours that will be held every other Thursday this month. With that, I wish everybody a great day.